All right, so we're up in the spare room at Wellspring Church leaning into our Able Project practices. We're focusing on E
Yeah.
and specifically hospitality.
Sure. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like all these videos, we're trying to anchor it in the narrative arc of Scripture and starting at the beginning.
Yeah, in the book of Genesis, we see God being depicted among many things, obviously
Yeah.
creator, sustainer, but as a host,
Yeah.
a generous host who has created all things, but has really created the world in such a way where Adam and Eve, the first humans,
Yeah.
are invited to delight in this new home.
Yeah.
And God is the provider of Adam and Eve to the point where they're able to enjoy and eat and delight
Totally.
in God's presence together. And so it's this beautiful picture that we have in Genesis 1 and 2 of God's hospitality to really all of creation and humanity.
And God creates the context, He welcomes them
Yes.
into a home, and provides them food.
Provides them food, right?
Yeah.
And so it's this very simple way of looking at the creation account in through the lens of hospitality.
Yeah.
Now, Adam and Eve, the first humans, they reject God's hospitality
Yeah,
to a certain
totally.
degree,
No,
right?
totally, they do.
And they go their own way, Genesis 3,
Yeah.
and sin begins to spiral, and not in such a way where it creates this rift between humans and
Yeah.
rift between humans and God's creation where hospitality becomes harder to practice. Now humans are sort of at each other's throats a little bit. But then as the story continues, God calls this one family, from the family of Abraham, to be a blessing not just to Abraham and his own family, but then to extend that blessing to all the other families of the world.
So He
And
creates a family and a community, but that community is meant to sort of bless those
Yes.
outside of themselves.
exactly. So it's the conduit of God's hospitality to extend beyond
Got it.
one's own family.
And they're
so,
image bearers, so that would make sense that
Exactly.
they would do as God did.
Exactly. And so as Abraham's family continues to grow and to flourish to a certain extent, they do end up in slavery under in Egypt, exactly. But as God rescues them out of Egypt, there's some really cool, interesting things that happen.
Yeah.
First, as they leave, after Passover, there's these hints throughout the exodus narrative that it's not just Israel, the Israelites per se, that are leaving, but there's actually other people groups that are involved in
that
this.
are like, whoa, your God's doing something cool.
Yes.
And God's heart there is to welcome those people
into the
There,
family,
yeah.
right? And so it's not just this mono-ethnic, kind of individual sort of thing. It's
Yeah.
this kind of collective, expanding family that's welcoming strangers. And so even as the Israel story progresses, even some of the laws within the Torah itself seem to have provision for the stranger or the foreigner to be welcomed into
There's a
the
value
family.
there.
Exactly. There's a value embedded within Israel's own kind of instruction in Torah for the other, for the outsider.
And even in the Exodus, right, they bring this sort of people group, primarily Hebrews, but
Yes.
some other people groups too. And then what is the first thing God does? He feeds them.
He feeds them.
leads them
Yes.
to water, and he gives
Totally,
them food
right.
in the wilderness.
And so they're experiencing the generosity and hospitality of God as God is continuing to lead and guide them.
And the prophets point to
Yes,
this too,
this
right?
is really cool to see when you kind of get into the biblical prophets. Isaiah in particular has some really interesting lines around chapter 19 where Isaiah talks about all these other nations, like Egypt, Assyria, who are
potentially rivals.
yeah, for a large part of the biblical story, they are rivals to Israel. But Isaiah talks about them, or God talks about them through Isaiah as, quote, my people.
Wow.
And that phrase, my people, has been used primarily for Israel itself throughout the Old Testament story. But as the prophets look towards the future, they see God bring together not just Israel, but people from all the nations of the world into this family to the point where Isaiah says, no, these are also my people. And then it kind of keeps building as Isaiah continues, Isaiah 25, 26, talking about this great feast where all the people of the world are coming together to
There's gonna be
feast.
good
Food and wine
and
and like the choicest, finest meats.
Yeah.
And so this is all foreshadowing what's going to happen when Messiah comes and kind of gathers in and shows the hospitality of God once again.
You have this picture of God as host, as he hosted creation at the beginning, he will host creation
at the end. Yeah, and to see those bookends of the generous host showing the hospitality, the generosity to not, again, just Israel, but to all the peoples of the world.
And then you have God taking on human flesh, entering sort of the story itself. And what do we see?
For sure. So this is Jesus, right? And so Jesus comes, and it's kind of interesting. Scholars have pointed this out. One of the favorite titles for Jesus himself is the phrase, the Son of Man. Now, 3 different times throughout the 4 Gospels, you'll find the phrase, the Son of Man came to, and then fill in the blank. The first 2, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And it came to not serve, or not to be served, to serve, but not be served, and to give his life as a ransom for many. But then the third way that sentence is often framed in the 4 Gospels, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. And so scholars point out, so here's Jesus' mission, to seek and to save the lost, and then the method of doing that mission is eating and drinking.
Hospitality.
Hospitality, exactly. And in particular in the 4 Gospels, the people that Jesus eats with are more or less from kind of the religious crowd considered to be these outsiders. These outcasts. These are the people.
And they don't like it.
They don't like
Luke
it.
15, like, why are you always eating
Exactly.
with these people?
And he becomes accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. He gets in trouble with eating with all the wrong kinds of people, showing God's hospitality, extending, again, not just to this small crew per se, but actually extending out, breaking borders, breaking barriers.
And then even riffing on Isaiah 25, in Luke 14, he tells this story or parable about this host who invites people, they deny, and then he says, he sends a servant out to the highways and the byways to gather all kinds of outsiders to the table.
It's like God is just extravagantly and persistently welcoming people into his family.
So then it's not surprising when the church forms
that
you have guys like Paul saying to the church in Rome, practice hospitality. Hey, church, if we're going to be following Jesus' image, we should do this too. This is who God is. This is what Jesus did. This is what we should do.
Totally, exactly. This is Romans 12 that you're referencing. And when Paul is saying that, it's a really interesting word that I think is worth kind of camping out on just a little bit. You know, it's philoxenia, kind of a compound word. And literally it just means the love of the stranger.
Which is a little different than xenophobia, which we know in English
the fear of the stranger, right? And so Paul is commanding, if you will, the church in Rome to show this radical hospitality, the love of the stranger, because that's exactly what Jesus has done for us. It's modeling the Christ-like posture in our everyday lives. Peter, a contemporary of Paul, a disciple of Jesus, kind of has this very similar line in 1 Peter 4, and I love this. Peter writes, "The end of all things is at hand, therefore," and then he has a number of things here. Be self-controlled, sober-minded, love one another, and then show hospitality without grumbling. And this is really cool because
everything's coming
to an end. You know, Peter, he doesn't say go hunker down, go hide. He says, no, extend love to the stranger. Show hospitality because this is what's going to happen at the end.
You're sort of embodying actually the messianic banquet that's
back to Isaiah 25, 26, which is forward-looking to Revelation 21 and 22, where all the nations of the world are welcome to the feast, are welcome to the table. And it's this beautiful sort of climactic ending to what started in the garden, God showing the hospitality to all of creation, ends in new creation, God showing that same hospitality, this time to all the people, all the nations of the world.
That's awesome. So then as we sort of shift from the scriptural arc to present day, like, I don't know, how is this applied in your life?
For sure. I think on a real sort of on the ground level, especially in our culture that, you know, with garage doors and, you know, our own homes where it's easy to just kind of go in and out and not really ever talk to your neighbor.
Like a literal neighbor.
Literal neighbor, right? When, you know, when we're told to love our neighbor or love the stranger, there's an aspect where I've been better at this at different times of my own life. It goes in seasons, but I think it really practically, just get to know the people like on your street. Know their names, know what they're doing, and invite them over. And have sort of this posture where it doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be like always glamorous, but embodying the hospitality of Jesus means, among other things, that we get to know the people that God has placed right in front of us.
This could be in our workplaces too.
Totally.
Extended family even that maybe don't know Jesus.
For sure.
Your favorite coffee shop location, barista or whatever.
And it's cool to think that even as Jesus was kind of walking around first century Galilee, you know, there's a couple lines that indicate that Jesus was basically homeless a lot of the time. But so many times when he's having meals with people, he is sort of embodying the posture of like the host, where he is the one who's welcoming in. And so for those who maybe are like, I don't have like the most perfect home or like, you know, all the right things to like host, there's a level of when we look at the life of Jesus, he didn't either. But it was about this, you've mentioned this too, like this heart posture of welcoming people into one's own life and showing the love and care and compassion of God.
I think, like a biblical critique of like Martha Stewart
hospitality,
right? Of like, and what we would say, I think, from a biblical perspective is that there's a difference between entertainment and hospitality. Right? We're not caring whether or not the food is unbelievable, whether your house is perfectly clean or a mansion or beautiful.
For sure.
But there's a heart posture of we are welcome a human being who's an outsider into our space to say, I love you as an extension of God's love.
Exactly. Yeah, and even kind of riffing off of what Peter said that we talked about a moment ago, to do that without grumbling or complaining.
Totally.
Because there's this aspect where, you know, we practice hospitality. You do it over the course of a life or over a season, right? It can become like, this person or this is going to go wrong. And so we have to really check our own hearts too, and to just be aware of what's the attitude, what's the heart posture we're to have in the midst of that. Peter says without grumbling.
When I was growing up, my mom, when we would have people over, she would often have me clean the bathrooms, and I would totally grumble.
Oh, yeah.
And be like,
not
these
again.
are our friends. Yeah. Why do we have to clean the toilets?
Exactly.
They don't care. And,
yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. I think a few things, like a tips for folks that are just in the church trying to lead into this. I think the first one would be from Paul's comments in Romans 12, that like hospitality takes some practice.
Practice, yeah.
Right? Like sometimes it's going to go better than others. You know, one time you might get anxious because you're burning the potatoes or whatever. And then you realize, okay, that didn't work. All right, how do I sort of do this? But it takes practice and comfort, and you do get into a rhythm.
Sure, yeah.
The second tip would be, I think, gets back to your heart posture question, and Peter, this idea of practice hospitality without grumbling, that like this isn't just open your door to the stranger.
Totally.
This is also open your door to the stranger with a heart that kind of mirrors or reflects God's heart for them. That the heart matters. And then there's one we haven't talked about, that there's like an unexpected element to hospitality. Hebrews talks about like sometimes you might entertain an angel.
Yeah, without being aware of it.
Without being aware of it. It's at Hebrews 11.
Hebrews 13, yeah, totally, yeah.
And then you also have in Luke 24 and the road to Emmaus, where you have two people walking home and they welcome Jesus into their home, but they don't know who it is. And he shows up. And there's this sense of, I think, in hospitality that God might be doing stuff that we're not even aware of. And it can actually lead to these profound spiritual moments of the presence of God.
Yeah, that's so cool. Just even having that, I guess, like hope or expectation of God's going to do something. I might not know what it is. I probably don't know what it is half the time. But to just have that expectation and that sort of desire to see God do things that I might not even think are possible in my relationships with the people in my life.
And this one makes it, I think, a cool spiritual practice. Sometimes we sort of discount or disconnect sometimes like a habit like hospitality from our actual connection to God. But we see in some of these, like, no, there's this hint of, oh, actually there's more of a connection than maybe we even realize.
Exactly. God's going to show up, and we're going to encounter God through others, through himself in profound ways.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Cool.